I'm Michelle Oshero, and it is my great fortune to be Associate Director of the Drescher Center for the Humanities and to serve as Director for the Humanities Scholars Program here at UMBC. I want to thank all of you for coming today. This is our final lecture in the Fall Humanities Forum Series, and I am especially delighted that we'll be hearing from Dr. Jessica Berman today, the Chair of the English Department here on campus. Today's event has some added significance, though, because we are also recognizing exemplary teachers. Each year, the freshman class of humanities scholars chooses to invite high school teachers to our campus who've had a profound effect on their learning and their education. We present these instructors with awards, we give them little gifts, and we get to hear from the students about what makes these teachers so outstanding. So the way this is going to work is that Dr. Berman will present her lecture. We'll have a few question and answers, and then I'm going to invite the freshman scholars to the front of the room to introduce their teachers to you. After that, I hope that you will join me in congratulating these teachers and to continuing conversations with Dr. Berman at a reception following this event. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Rebecca Bowling, the Director for the Drescher Center for the Humanities, to welcome today's speaker. Thank you.
Our speaker this afternoon at this last Humanities Forum of the semester is UMBC's own English professor and chair, Dr. Jessica Berman. Dr. Berman majored in history, and for those of you who don't know, I'm a historian, as an undergrad at Princeton University and received her MA and PhD with honors, I want to mention, in comparative literature from the University of Chicago. Before coming to UMBC in 1995, she taught at Marymount and George Washington University. She is currently chair, as I mentioned before, of the English department and affiliate associate professor of gender and women's studies. Her first book, Modernist Fiction, Cosmopolitanism and the Politics of Community, came out with Cambridge University Press in 2001 and in paperback in 2006. In the same year, she co-edited a book entitled Virginia Woolf Out of Bounds, Selected Papers from the 10th Annual Conference on Virginia Woolf, a conference which, thanks to Dr. Berman, was held here at UMBC in the summer of 2000. She has published over a dozen articles on various aspects of the writings of Virginia Woolf, Henry James, and James Joyce, and most recently has moved in her new work into the realm of transnational modernism. Those of you who were able to attend the dedication event of the Drescher Center for the Humanities back in September 2007 were fortunate enough to get a taste of her new project in the brief 5 minutes we gave her to provide a glimpse into it. Many people that got that brief glimpse into her work wanted to know more, myself included. So I'm especially pleased that she has agreed to present at the Humanities Forum this fall. It's especially nice that she is speaking today when we are honoring our humanities scholars' exemplary teachers. Dr. Berman has been quite involved with our humanities scholars over the years. She has mentored many scholars on their English department honors theses and their publications in the UMBC Review. Dr. Berman and I actually first really got to know each other, and what a pleasure it was, I have to say, when we team taught a Humanities Scholar seminar ourselves in the spring of 1999 on the experiences of gender. The talk she will be giving today, Reading Fiction, Reading Politics, Transnational Modernism and Political Commitment in the Mid-20th Century, is part of her current book project entitled From Ought to Is, Modernism, Ethics, Politics, which is currently under contract with Columbia University Press. With no further ado then, joining me in welcoming Dr. Jessica Berman.
It's really a pleasure to be here, and as Rebecca said, I'm always happy to be part of this Humanities Scholars Program. I think I'm supposed to put that on. Okay. And also, I should apologize for a miserable cold, so my voice is not great, and I will be sniffling. Be prepared. All right. Throughout my research career, I've been interested in connections between history and literature. My background made me that way. And I'm interested in the ways that narrative can be seen to be political. I've been especially intrigued by showing how texts that are usually considered experimental nonetheless engage with the real world often in very surprising ways. In my first book, I demonstrated how writers like Virginia Woolf and Gertrude Stein could help us revise and expand our understanding of the meaning of community and its relationship to cosmopolitanism. My new book, you've just heard, tentatively titled From Ought to Is, Modernism, Ethics, Politics, will extend the discussion in my first book by examining the nature of politics itself and looking at a broader range of writers, both canonical and less so, from both margins and centers of power. I want to talk today about a part of this project, the connection between experimental modernism and politics. Modernism is a critical term that is and has always been in flux. Critics disagree about almost every aspect of the definition of modernism to such an extent that we now routinely refer to modernisms in the plural instead of using a singular noun. And I'm hoping this is going to work. Got the thing set up? Let's see if, there we go. Oh. There are three ways that we can think about modernism or modernisms. The first is we can define it as the new or experimental literature of a particular time period. Many take the starting point for European modernism to be 1856 and 1857. For literature in English, the 1890s mark the beginning of the period. And 1922 is often considered its high point, the year of T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland, James Joyce's Ulysses, Catherine Mansfield's The Garden Party, and Virginia Woolf's Jacob's Room, among many others. It's an amazing year. Most have talked about modernism as waning in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, but many current critics speak of modernism as continuing up to the present day, especially outside Europe and the US. And I'd be happy to talk to people about some of the people we might consider modernist. J.M. Coetzee is one of them, for example. So the jury's really out still on this point about the period. In this talk today, I'll be looking at one text from the teens, one from the 30s, and one from the 40s. Another way of defining modernism has to do with its concerns, which are clearly connected to the time period when it arises. Modernism grows out of the attempt to represent in literature the changing conditions of modern life: industrialization, urbanization, technological change, for example, the rise of the automobile, the cinema, the telegraph. The rise and fall of empires is important, new developments in warfare, the economic developments of late capitalism, and the critique of late capitalism, especially stemming from Marx. New ideas in philosophy are also important, especially from Nietzsche and his philosophical questioning of religion and truth with a capital T. From Freud, we have new developments in psychology, the discovery of the unconscious, which destabilizes ideas of self-identity. And from science, and especially Einstein, notions of relativity and the connection between time and space. The changing status of women and other marginalized groups is also a key component of modern life or modernity, and important, crucially, to the development of modernism. I have to say, a little caveat, you heard that I'm involved in gender and women's studies, but there's nary a woman in this talk. I think that's the only time that I've ever done that, but I am happy also in the Q&A to talk more about women's roles in all of this. The third way to understand modernism focuses on its aesthetic characteristics. In this view, the experimental formal aspects of writers' responses to modernity would be key. So of course, this is related to the developments of modernity and the period in which the writers write. I mean, this is really part of the point here, that all these three categories are interconnected, and the problem is when only one of them is used to talk about modernism or the definition of it. There was a perception among writers that modernity posed a crisis of representation. In other words, that 19th century strategies for representing reality didn't fit with the demands of the new world they found themselves in. So writers became self-consciously experimental. They wanted readers to be aware of the page. The page is something crafted, something they were reading. They didn't want you to pretend that it was reality. They tried new techniques like fragmentation, montage, collage, or in fiction, stream of consciousness, rather than using a reliable, omniscient narrator to represent their new experience of the world. There are a whole host of other experimental techniques. I've got them up here, and I could go on about these. Anybody who's been in one of my classes knows I can go on about these, but I'm not going to do that today. I'm especially concerned in this talk with the tunneling into subjective points of view and the presentation of multiple realities or truths through fragmented or repetitious narration. The problem is that all this experimentation often obscures the continuing interest among modernists with the world around them, the problems of history and questions of politics, and with those aspects of modernity that I just mentioned. Modernist experimentation often appears solipsistic. You know, they're noodling around with form and language. They're not talking about anything but themselves. There's so much emphasis on inner states of experience and perception that the outside world disappears. Modernism is often derided for abandoning the social world in favor of narcissistic interest in language and its processes. And because modernists recognize the failure of language to transparently communicate meaning or mirror reality directly, because they did this, they used their writing to focus our attention on these failures. They are often described as having downplayed content and connection to social life or politics in favor of an investigation of form. So it's important to remember that modernists want to bring form and content together. They tried to revise the form so that it better represented their experiences of modernity and the role they believed that art should play in the world. I put an example in art up on the screen to begin, to help us think quickly about the interaction between experimentation in form or technique and the content of a work. Anybody who was at the Drescher Center opening has seen this already. Forgive me for repeating it. I think it works nicely to sort of bring up these questions about how reality and experimentation might go together. And I want to add a caveat. I am not an art historian. I'm sure art historians would cringe about what I might say about Picasso. But one look at Picasso's Guernica, and I think you can see that this is a modernist work. I hope everybody recognizes this as modernist. But we can see here aspects of it. Clearly, fragmentation, the sense that it's representing a chaotic scene or a chaotic world. It's clearly not realistic, right? We are not looking at a landscape. This is supposed to be a picture of a scene in Guernica, which is a town, but we don't see that. The background, there's no attempt at depth. There's no sense that we could enter this scene and just pretend we're there. So that's what it means to say this is not realistic. It's not a direct mirror of reality. And yet, it's very concerned with representing the world. Right? So you see, this is the scene of bombing in Guernica, and you see certainly disembodied heads, a wailing woman, a corpse on the ground, a horse who's injured. It, I think, heightens reality in the way that it is represented here. At least that would be my argument. It certainly heightens our understanding of the suffering or of the chaos of the day that this is presenting. And I may add, it also responds to the technology of warfare. This is one of the first examples of carpet bombing, when the nationalists bombed Guernica. So you're seeing the effect of warfare that comes into a town rather than there being a war front that is separate from where people live. Okay. So I hope it's clear that from looking at this painting, how an abstract modernist work of art can also be political and can ask us as viewers to become engaged with the struggle. In fact, you might say that the experimental modernist aspect of this painting almost makes it more compelling than if Picasso had painted a straightforward scene of a massacre. You know, that wailing woman, the disembodied head, I think that's pretty striking. Modernist fiction, I want to argue, can work in some of the same ways by looking at the moments when novels are both experimental and politically engaged. I'm trying to figure out the role that experimental narratives can play in the development of conceptions of politics and action. So I'm going to turn away from Guernica, but we'll get back to the Civil War later. One example I often talk about is James Joyce. His work is famously difficult, but I can say that a group of students read Ulysses with me in a seminar last spring, and they did very well. And because our humanities scholars are so very good, they actually read it in a first-year humanities core course several years ago. So yes, it can be done. But I want to turn to Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, which was published in 1916. That's the first page, and it's on your handout as well. Okay, so you want to look at it. And I'm going to show you 3 first pages of novels in various decades and different places and times. So that's what you've got on your handout. This first page is a very famous example of literary modernism. It shows us life is focused through the eyes of Joyce's hero, Stephen Dedalus, who is still a young boy. Over the course of the novel, he grows up, struggles with his identity as a Catholic and an Irishman living under British colonial rule, and becomes an artist. The style of the novel will develop with Stephen. It's what we call focalized through Stephen. We get his thoughts, often in what seems to be his language, without guidance from an external narrator, and without the ability to get much objective distance. We'll read his adolescent musings, his immersion in Catholic piety, his arguments with his university friends about literature and politics, and finally on the last pages we read his journal as he readies himself to move abroad, become an artist, and as he puts it, quote, to forge in the smithy of his soul the uncreated conscience of his race. The novel is thus not only about Stephen's personal development, but also about his coming to terms with the status of Ireland as a British colony. But Stephen is notoriously conflicted about the movements of Irish national liberation of his time, as was Joyce himself. Stephen must go off into the world in order to be able to write about Ireland, as did Joyce. In Ulysses, Stephen Dedalus is also given the famous line, "History is a nightmare from which I am trying to awake." And I don't have the answer to what that means. By the way, I was asked that on my PhD orals. What does that line mean? And it's a tough question. But it seems he wants to escape history, or at least the particular history that he's in, and certainly the long-established way of understanding how history will progress into the future. So critics have long debated the role of politics in this novel. If he's escaping from history, how can he be participating in politics? And the role of politics in Joyce's work in particular, because he did not stay in Ireland and become politically active. How can we understand his connection to the Irish struggles then? What do we see here? So I want to look at this particular page to see if we can find something here. These experimental opening pages of the novel, which seem to be completely introspective, they're the thoughts of a small child thinking about his story as his father has told him, making random connections. They seem to be the kind of navel-gazing that gives modernism a bad name, right? You can't quite understand what's going on. You can't even really read it, maybe. In reality, I think we can see that they introduce Stephen as a subjectivity intertwined with his family and determined by his social and historical setting. In the beginning, once upon a time, and a very good time it was, there was a moo cow coming down along the road. Whose voice are we hearing there? This is, the modernist beginning without a third-person narration. You don't know whose voice you're getting. Whether this is a direct transcription of the father's voice telling the young Stephen a story, the story told indirectly through the main narrator's perspective, or a recasting of an oft-told story in the young Stephen's voice, we can see that Stephen's voice at this moment is inseparable from his father's. And even as we continue, his father told him that story. His father looked at him through a glass. He had a hairy face. The narrative's perspectives are merging, right? The story told him and what he's thinking. We know from a letter of John James's to his son that this was a story Joyce heard from his father. We also know that it was a version of an Irish myth, important because Irish mythology became the material of the Irish revival and of efforts to develop cultural nationhood. In other words, its use at the beginning of the story is deeply political. The song that follows, too, and you only just get a little bit, the green watha bothath, right? That little bit of a song has also been interpreted as referring to the Irish situation. The reference to the green little place, which comes from the actual song that's being represented in Stephen's language here. The green, you get that at least. The green little place is almost certainly Ireland. Thus, in beginning Stephen Dedalus' story of development with this tale, Joyce inserts him into a narrative frame that immediately widens from the specific and personal, the father speaking to Stephen, to the cultural and mythic. Given that the status of the founding mythologies of Irish culture is precisely what's at stake in the Irish struggle against colonial rule, this moment also begins the novel's constant engagement with anti-colonial struggle and the pitfalls of national consciousness. The first pages of the novel define Stephen within a complex social and cultural discursive field which is intricately tied to its politics, and they do so by way of the experimental subjective style. A few pages later, we learn about Stephen's sense of his place as a school child in the world. And I'm just going to show this one quickly. You don't have that on your handout. This is a very famous page from the book. He writes this inside his school book. This is the most overt example we have about his definition of himself. Here he wants to inhabit both local and global contexts. It's a fantasy of how the world can emerge from his place in Dublin. But the novel makes clear over and over that Stephen can't simply define himself. Throughout the book, there's constant play on his name. Characters remark on it and its foreignness. The students in school call it, repeat it, turn it into a mocking song. Stefanos Dedalos, Stephanophoros, they're constantly repeating this. The rhythm and sound become more important than the meaning of the words. As the students use it, they get the power to make Stephen into whatever they like, to take control of his growing identity, at least for a minute, and to remake him into a foreigner among other foreigners and conquerors of Dublin. A foreigner who has to prove himself as worthy of being Irish by learning Gaelic folk tales. So the constant challenge is there. How can he understand his obligation to his country? This experimental novel, so steeped in subjective experience and a single consciousness, nonetheless makes clear that the problem of Stephen's identity and his longing for worldly status is inextricable from the problem of Ireland and its desire for independence. And yet, I think there's really little way to understand this conflicted character as politically active in the regular sense of the term. He's an artist, he's not necessarily going to become political, and of course, Joyce himself also never directly engaged in politics. So it's hard to know at this point then, how can we understand this book as political? Well, as it turns out, the celebrated Indian writer Mukraj Anand, who many of you have not heard of, who was a follower of Gandhi, a political activist, and one of the so-called big three writers of the late colonial period in India, found inspiration as a young man in Joyce's writings. He used and expanded Joyce's method in order to help create a modernism for India that would be both experimental and engaged in the fight against poverty and empire. In his collection of essays, Conversation in Bloomsbury, Mukraj Anand described how Joyce's portrait of the artist nurtured his desire to write. He says, "I recognized myself in the hero of Portrait." In Portrait, Joyce presented a version of what was taking place within Anand himself as a young artist coming of age in a different British colony, interested in representing the personal and political struggle that he knew. Anand takes instruction from Joyce's presentation of the problem of a self caught within the social and political constraints of culture and empire, but also from his way of focalizing the narrative through a main character, employing wordplay as a vehicle for social commentary, and using rhythm and sound to transmit extra-linguistic meaning in prose. All of these elements combine in his effort to forge a new English language tradition in fiction for India. For Anand, Stephen Dedalus's phrase, "I go to forge in the smithy of my soul the uncreated conscience of my race," gave purpose to his own aspirations as a writer and his long-term activism for Indian independence. And he says this exactly, right? That's the phrase that spoke to him. But we can also see Anand's use of that phrase as important for understanding Joyce. The connection between the two authors provides us with a transnational perspective on colonial writing and a means of seeing the political implications of modernist experimental narrative style. When we read Joyce and Anand together, we're pushed to see the critique of colonialism in works by both writers and the very real political engagement extended and made more overt in Anand's work of their modernist narrative modes. But let me just take a minute to talk to you about Anand, because I think nobody knows who he is. Mukraj Anand was born in Peshawar in 1905 to the family of a civil servant and began writing poetry as a teenager. After 1918, Anand got swept up in the growing rebellion in the Punjab. He was arrested and caned in Amritsar, where his family had been living, for innocently breaking curfew during the Jallianwala Bagh massacre of 1919, one of the most bloody and infamous conflicts in the history of the Raj. British soldiers opened fire on 10,000 civilians, sort of indiscriminately. He was again arrested in 1924 for political activism in Lahore. Afterwards, he traveled to London to study philosophy, in part to escape the problem of having been active in India. And his growing connections within the London literary world brought him into the living rooms of Leonard and Virginia Woolf, into contact with E.M. Forster, who ultimately helped him publish his first novel, and into the employ of T.S. Eliot at the literary journal The Criterion. And we wonder why we haven't heard of him, right? I mean, he experienced the 1926 general strike in London as a watershed event in which he recognized similarities between the British workers and the untouchables of India. As he put it, not only were the British imperious and strong-minded in the colonies, but they could also suppress their own working people. From this moment, he resolved to return to India and to use his art in the service of the ordinary people of his country. When he returned to India in 1932 with a book mostly written, he went straight to Gandhi's ashram, where the story goes, and we don't have any proof, it's an apocryphal story, Gandhi himself helped edit what was to become Anand's first novel, Untouchable. Anand was politically active in the independence movement and in other liberation movements from that time forward. In fact, he later traveled to Spain to fight in the Spanish Civil War. He was at the same time an incredibly prolific writer. By the time of his death in 2004, he had written at best count 18 novels, 3 collections of short stories, several books of essays, including such seminal works as Is There a Contemporary Indian Civilization? And many collections of Indian fairy tales. His work is celebrated for his depiction of the everyday struggles of impoverished Indians who become the heroes of his novels. His 1935 novel, Untouchable, places an untouchable boy at the center of the novel, just as Joyce placed Stephen, and imbues him with interiority and complexity in a way that was truly revolutionary. Before this time, we do not have lower caste Indians in literature. And there are others at the time who are beginning to do it, but it is really a moment of revolution in terms of the focus that he puts on this character. Even more than Joyce, Anand makes clear the role of the British imperial system in the abject poverty of his characters and uses his depiction of it to exhort his audience to agitate for change. So this is the next step that happens when you look at Anand patterning Untouchable on the portrait, that you begin to see how that can become agitation for change. Anand is also justly celebrated for having insisted that the Indian vernacular should enter the Indian novel in English. And this is the very beginning of the English novel in India. And it was not yet clear how writers in India would make that language their own. It was the colonial language that was imposed on them. So, or how they would use it to capture Indian life and languages, even though they were writing in English. Anand takes the rhythms and vocabulary of Hindustani and he puts them directly into the English language novel. So you sometimes get moments that read as nonsensical in English, but they create a sort of hybrid language that belongs to India. This itself, I think, is a political act. It's a way of claiming the language for India and of rejecting the dominance of the English cultural heritage. So when you read these nonsensical moments in the novels, we can read them as sort of modernist moments, but we will also read them as political moments. And any of you who read current English language novels from India or written in India know that this sort of hybridity has become one of the characteristics of English fiction. So, Anand is sort of the beginning of this process. I want to stop for a minute to talk about Anand's second novel, Coolie, which is published in 1936, because I hope you'll see a connection back to the first page of Portrait. Coolie follows the short lifetime of a poor Indian laborer, Munu, who was forced out of his home in a hill village and sent to find his way through a number of menial jobs in an extraordinary series of locations throughout India. While working as a servant for a bank official, in a pickle factory, in a cotton mill, or as a rickshaw boy before his death at 15 from consumption, Manu encounters the entire social fabric of India. He's befriended in unexpected places, among other servants, coolies, and cotton mill workers, but also in the house of the pickle factory owner and in the home of an emancipated Anglo-Indian woman. Yet the brilliance of the novel is not in the specific details of the various trials that Manu is made to face. Rather, it lies in the novel's focus on Manu's internal life and his struggle to respond to the varieties of discourse that surround him and the power hierarchies associated with them, and in Anand's use of a narrative technique indebted to Joyce that's limited to what Manu can know and understand, and which develops over the course of the novel as Manu grows up. Coolie begins with a call to the hero, Manu oe manua o mundu. And this line repeats at the beginning of each of the 3 opening paragraphs, calling him to obey the summons of his aunt, that's who's calling, and calling him into existence for us as readers of the narrative. The young boy Manu hears but does not answer this call, willfully ignoring her and commenting to a friend on the next page, "My aunt wants me to begin earning money. My uncle says I'm grown up and must fend for myself." You don't have this, sorry. It's the next page of the book, I didn't give it to you. We as readers do not learn much more about the identity of Manu. At the beginning of the novel, Manu lacks the possibility of accounting for himself. He'd be unable to respond to the question, "Who are you?" He can say, "My aunt wants me to be this, my uncle wants me to be that." We hear him called, we don't hear how he would define himself. Just as Stephen in the opening pages of Portrait would have been unable to account for himself without reference to those around him. The repeated line of sing-song syllables spun out of his name stands for the way that those around Manu define him in his place, much as the boys calling Stephanophoros in Portrait did. He has no say here. He becomes first what his family wants him to be, and then what the culture makes him. Even the title of the book, Coolie, tells us that he belongs to a class of people who, like untouchables, are not usually considered as individuals. Like Stephen, he's constructed in the narrative as always within a social and political matrix. Unlike Stephen, he dies before he can leave or speak back to it. In fact, the novel functions as an extended rumination on what is missing from our understanding of a boy like Manu, a simple Indian coolie, and the problem raised by his inability as an illiterate colonial subject to give his own account of his life the way that Stephen ultimately can. The gap behind the almost incoherent call, Manu oe manua, addressed both to the boy and to us as readers, contains the germ of the important claims of the novel, that the important claims the novel makes for its coolie hero, as well as obligations it places on us as readers who must step towards Manu in order to try to understand his life and the way it has been limited by his poverty and his colonial status. It's hard to resist this novel's claims on our attention and our sympathy. It's simply a wonderful book. It's out of print. I'm trying to bring it back. At the time of its writing, it seemed so clearly incendiary that it was banned by British India, as was Anand's first novel, Untouchable, and that one is in print. Penguin, you can get that one. The experimental use of perspective, narration, and language combines with Anand's choice of a coolie hero to make this novel both modernist and deeply political. If the call to engagement we see in Cooley is more directly connected to a political agenda and more overt in the claims it makes on its readers than that Joyce displayed in Portrait, when we turn to a later example of writing on the Spanish Civil War, the political implications become even more explicit and specific. Because Spanish writers often describe specific events and battles or crucial issues that divided sides in the war, the literature of the Spanish Civil War is generally both concerned with representing the chaotic reality of war and deeply partisan at once. As George Orwell wrote in his essay, Homage to Catalonia, on such an issue as this, no one is or can be completely truthful. It's difficult to be certain about anything except what you have seen with your own eyes, and consciously or unconsciously, everyone writes as a partisan. So at least according to Orwell, there's no point in pretending to objectivity. It simply wasn't possible. And here you will recall that one of the key modernist issues is this crisis of representation, the sense that reality or truth is unrepresentable, at least in the traditional forms. Or that the truths might demand multiple perspectives or subjective perspectives rather than just one. In that way, perhaps, we could say the Spanish Civil War, like World War I before it, becomes itself a sort of pivotal modernist event, a sign of the height of modernity, one that certainly brings to the fore the changing landscape. Max Aube, one of the most significant writers on the Spanish Civil War, though still largely unknown to English language readers, embraced these challenges to conventional realism and the problem of partisanship. And the problem today, talking about two writers that nobody's ever heard of outside of their home countries. His magnum opus, a 6-volume work called El Labyrinto Mágico, or The Magic Labyrinth in English, is a spectacular and wide-ranging chronicle of the war's effect on ordinary people and takes up a variety of characters and perspectives, from a young boy who flirts with the fascists, getting swept up in the destruction of Barcelona in the early days of the war, to a group of partisans who hold out during the siege of Madrid. Active himself in the Republican resistance and committed to a vision of Spain rooted in the democratic experiments of the Second Republic, Aube eschews any attempt at omniscience or at a balanced point of view. He uses his writing to engage his audience with the struggle. And this is different from some of the other Spanish language writers on the war who pretend to some objectivity. One of them famously read 1,000 books in preparation for writing his novel. So, like Anand, and even more so like Picasso's Guernica, with which I began, the dramatic picture Aube paints of the failing republic, the chaos of war, and the horrors committed by the nationalists exhorts its readers towards action. The novel as a whole works on the most direct level as reporting, though never objective reporting, and on the most abstract as meditation on humanity and the situation of war. Taking place primarily on the home rather than the war front, Aube's novel also innovates in its insistence that the war might be chronicled without long battle scenes, there are none, without description of weaponry or detail of the hardship of the front. And those are the sort of cliches of Spanish Civil War writing. And here too, I think it's like Guernica, right? It is about that home place that gets bombed rather than about the heroic soldiers who go to fight. Most significantly, Aube's novel marries the experimentalism of pre-war Spanish avant-garde writing to the effort at representation that characterizes war narratives, incorporating shifts of time and perspective, nonlinear structures, and the use of fantasy. So he comes at this, he's a later, slightly later generation. He comes at this almost in the opposite direction. He's a modernist first, who then becomes interested in reality and politics rather than the other way around. Alb was born Max Alb Morenwitz in Paris in 1903 to a French Jewish mother and a German father. When war broke out in 1914, Alb's father was caught in Spain, and realizing that his German background would make him unwelcome in France, remained in Valencia and brought his family to join him. Once Alb had finished his basic schooling, he joined his father's business, traveling with him throughout Spain and on his own in Europe. It's in this period that his lifelong identification with the country developed, despite his foreign birth and the fact that Spanish was not his native language. He supposedly always spoke Spanish with a French accent. Yet he was a cosmopolitan in the deepest sense of the word. He was both rooted locally and at home in the world. And I think this is really true of all three of these writers, and something I'm very interested in terms of thinking about cosmopolitanism and politics. Alb began writing short prose poems and theater sketches as an amateur before leaving school, and when Ortega y Gasset began publishing La Revista de Occidente, the premier vehicle for Spanish vanguardismo, literally vanguardism, but which we might loosely call avant-garde modernism. This is a pre-war Spain. He became immediately under its influence and soon began publishing in its pages. Alb can thus be said to have come of age with the development of literary modernism in Spain and to have the imprimatur of Ortega, its literary doyen. Alb's writing in his early years focuses on form, irony, and farce at the expense of reality. Yet for members of Alb's generation, young in 1925, the practice of what was called at the time dehumanized art, and that's Ortega's term, sort of the head of the school of vanguardismo, termed it dehumanized art, left their growing political interests and commitments without means of expression. By 1928, Alb had become a socialist. He became increasingly involved in left-leaning politics and began to publish essays in leftist journals. In 1933, he traveled to Russia to see socialist theater. He became director of a politically oriented theater in 35-36, and by 36-37, this is just before the war, right? He's in charge of the socialist newspaper Verdad, Truth. It seems that for Alb, the breakdown of the wall between politics and art and the transformation of Ortegan dehumanized art into something new was inevitable. The first step for Alb was helping André Malraux create a film of his political novel L'Espoir, which is Man's Hope in English, a very celebrated novel of the time. And Alb wrote the screenplay and helped Malraux film it. They filmed it in Barcelona right before it fell to Franco, and they literally went scurrying out of town with the film. They finished it. It wasn't quite finished. They finished it in France. The final switch for Alb came after 1939 when he was arrested as he crossed the border into France and put into concentration camps, first in France and later in Algeria. When he managed to escape to Mexico in 1942, he carried along with him manuscripts that would develop into this great 6-volume work, El Labyrinth Mágico, or The Magic Labyrinth, which he began publishing in 1943. He was ultimately successful in the exile community in Mexico. It's a whole other chapter of his life. By his death in 1972, he had written several plays, 2 collections of poems, many short stories, at least 7 novels, 6 of which are in this cycle. What emerges in Alb's work during the war and grows in El Labyrinto Mágico is a new narrative mode merging vanguardism or experimental modernism with politically engaged writing. Alb raises the issue of representation of the world and the writer's responsibility to his time and place without relinquishing modernist ideas about the subjectivity of experience and the impossibility of direct representation of reality in writing. The novels of El Labyrinto combine subjectivity of perspective with increasing focus on the surrounding world, a priority in the view of reality as filtered through subjectivity into narrative. And this is not unlike Joyce's technique or that of Virginia Woolf, but with a more political focus. In El Labyrinto Mágico, Aub will introduce a myriad of characters and situations, but rarely with extensive description either of themselves or the things around them. The war is presented through the reactions of characters to events around them rather than through direct description, thus pushing the reader into experiencing the chaotic world of Civil War Spain directly. We're plunged right into it, just like we are when we watch Guernica. We look at Guernica. Time in the novels accelerates and decelerates. Places are often indeterminate. Dialogue is freely intercut and interrupted, and the plots of the 6 novels in the cycle become more and more labyrinthine. In Campo Abierto, you translate that open field. They all are field, closed field, open field, French field, field of almonds, and it goes on. Those are the names of the volumes. In Campo Abierto, the second novel of the sequence, the characters appear without warning or introduction, and we catch them in the middle of very dramatic situations. Aub provides very little description throughout the novel. Where we are, who these characters might be, even what they look like seems beside the point. You have a translation on the flip of the Spanish in your handout. The novel begins, for example, with a section titled Gabriel Rojas, which plunges us immediately into the presence of Gabriel and his wife, who is about to give birth. No background information is given. We see the couple struggle towards the bedroom, but Angela delivers the baby before making it to the bed. Gabriel rushes for the doctor, arrives at his home, and is told he has already started for their apartment. Relieved, Gabriel begins to return home, thinking about his new daughter and unaware of the battle which is waging on the street. We're in the opening moments of the war. This page is the opening moments of the war, but we do not yet know it, and neither does the character, right? So we share that perspective. Within minutes, however, he's caught in the crossfire and killed. Melodramatic as that action may sound, Aub presents it very dispassionately, without added description, without pathos surrounding Gabriel's death. We're told that he's not aware of the rin-tin-tin in the street. We share his ignorance, unable to see the development of the fighting. All that occurs, this is the quote from the end, un ruido seco, un golpe, negro. A sharp noise, a blow, black. It all happens without explanation. In this manner, Aub introduces us at once to the chaos and the indiscriminate violence of street fighting and to a mode of pared-down subjective reporting that can be true to that experience and yet still ultimately partisan. At the same time, the novel's first page, like many of the chapter headings in its third part, begins with an inscription of the date, 24 July 1936. This marks the novel as situated during the first battles in the cities at the very beginning of the war. As I said, the war starts in Morocco on July 18th and 24 hours later on the mainland in Spain. So we're at the first days. We're also in Valencia, which is an important place for the Republicans and for battles in the early days of the war. Though the battles do not enter directly into most of the action, which takes place primarily within doors and among a small set of civilian characters, Aub here demonstrates the interweaving of history and fiction that's crucial to the cycle. The volume continues until 7 November 1936, which is the eve of the crucial battle for Madrid, the day on which, expecting defeat, the Republican government moved from Madrid to Valencia. The Republican forces were unexpectedly able to hold off a major onslaught by the Nationalists, so it's a heroic day. And the historic battle for Madrid was an episode that demonstrated the potential power of the Republican coalition government, and especially the ability of the people themselves, when determined, to stave off defeat at the hands of the better supplied and trained Nationalists. Key moments from the street fighting invade the novel in its third section. Characters that throughout earlier parts of the novel seem distant from the war or disconnected from each other appear on the scene together, all of a sudden fighting, fleeing, or struggling in some way. Just as the citizens of Madrid found themselves swept into the fight, no matter what their personal inclinations, so the characters of this novel join the battle in this scene and become historic players in later volumes of the cycle. Key personages from history also often appear among the fictional characters of the novel. Each of the 6 novels takes place in different key historical moments from pre-war until post-war. Alb composed these first volumes soon after the events depicted and during a period in which Spain and its future was still being contested. These volumes thus play the role of direct reporting and even more significantly, outrage against the war from every angle. In an essay, Alb writes, "On the 18th of July, 1936, the reaction rose up and began the war. This storm and splitting of such force directly influenced literary production. Alb's marriage of partisan reporting with modernist technique is the result." So to wrap up, in the examples I've shared with you today, I hope you've been able to glimpse something of how the new languages and techniques of modernist fiction contribute to the possibility of political engagement, and how in turn concern with the political can go hand in hand with literary experimentation. Finally, I hope you'll agree with the point Sartre made long ago, that art loses nothing in engagement. On the contrary, the always new requirements of the social and the metaphysical engage the artist in finding a new language and new techniques. Thanks.
You have a glass of water.
I have a
and
glass
I'm
of
sure
water.
there's some questions out here. Yes.
How is the connection between technique and politics different in modernism from cases like Voltaire or Victor Hugo?
Well, I think that Voltaire would be representing the reality sort of as a transmission directly through the narrative, right?
Is that less effective politically?
I would argue that in some ways it is, yes. I mean, I think this sort of, the insistence of modernism that you're plunged into the scene and that you have to figure it out for yourself, or that you are immersed in a subjective perspective, insists that you come closer to the text in that way. You can't rely on the consensus of the third person to filter the reality for you. You have to engage with it more directly. Yeah.
But do you think that is somewhat alienating on a personal level? I mean,
Can
nobody
be.
has Guernica up in their bedroom or anything like that.
You know, Guernica is a very popular image, and it was traveled around in the time period. It was used as sort of propaganda for the Republicans, and people sort of fought over where they were going to display it. So I'm not sure. I don't know. Is it off-putting? They had it in the Museum of Modern Art in New York for ages, and then the Spanish wanted it back. But there was a big battle. Oh, they wanted to keep it in New York. Yeah.
Did you study other examples of post-colonial work, and did you find modernism to be major influence in other post-colonial authors outside of?
Outside of Anand and, yeah. I have a chapter on women writers in India. They're not post-colonial, they're colonial, late colonial, right? And the book is really focused on that period, so it isn't a post-colonial book. But yes, there are lots of other writers who are pulling up these attitudes and these techniques in order to engage with modernity in India. I focus on India because that's what I've researched, but you can find it in Africa. You can certainly find it in other colonial places. One of the movements that's happening among scholars of modernism, which usually is talked about mostly in terms of Europe and the US, is to move out to other places and to talk about how modernism might have developed in different ways and in different styles or with different concerns in different places. If we talk about it as a response to modernity, then a response to Indian modernity might look different than a response to English modernity. Yes? Uh-huh. I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Can you recap the artist that you talked about?
Picasso's image of Guernica, and I can show it to you again if you like. Am I getting there? There we go. Right. Spanish Civil War image, one of the most celebrated. Yes.
I just wonder about where the whole reception question comes in
Mhm.
here, since you're looking at fiction and politics in terms of, is there a way that you can tell that one is reacting directly to the other? I mean, of course, you talk about Joyce directly affecting Anand.
Right.
Can you trace it all the way through? I mean,
Well, you certainly have without, because he is in the cosmopolitan avant-garde in the 20s and 30s, and we don't talk. Spanish modernism is actually just as marginalized as other modernisms farther away. We don't usually talk about it when we talk about the high modernist art in Europe, but they were all in Paris back and forth, and they certainly read and encountered. He had every journal, every major literary journal coming into his house. So
do we actually see an effect on politics from these writings, because of these writings?
an effect on politics because of, well, I mean, I
They're
can't
responding
say,
to politics, but they're also trying,
Right.
particularly in Al's case, trying to move things.
they're, right. So I would say that you can't, say, okay, these 5 people went out and got engaged, joined up as a result of reading, and we could maybe find some readers, but that would be hard to do. In Al's case, because he's writing in exile, it's doubly complicated. But what happens with the exile community is that they're constantly trying to re-infiltrate Spain. So where you would find the political effect in the aftermath would be in resistance to Franco's Spain that's coming from the exile community in Mexico. And yes, I would say that this kind of material does definitely fuel a lot of that activism. Yeah.
Did you choose Faulkner in this, what he's doing, it's after the Civil War, so it's a kind of similar thing, and I'm sure those elements are there. Why,
Right.
is that just a choice of
Why I don't
yours?
have
Does he
Faulkner in
not-
there?
Does he not fit your model? Is there something you're looking at different, or?
Well, I'll tell you, partly what I'm looking at is a question that not unlike Professor Bowling's came to me after my first book. And people said, well, you're not really talking about politics. You're talking about some idea of politics. It's not real politics. So I sort of challenged myself in this book to find writers who were actually in a struggle somewhere, So that's partly, Faulkner is
Right.
not himself on the battlefield in Spain, but, being put in a concentration camp. But the other thing about it is that one of the purposes of the book is this expansion of modernism beyond the standard canon. So I begin with Virginia Woolf, actually, in a chapter in Woolf and Jean Rhys, and then Joyce and his connection to Anand, but then I move out into these other Indian women writers and the Spanish Civil War writers, and actually come back to U.S. writers in the 30s, labor writers, for the final chapter. So,
Going back to the U.S., if we talk about these writers during this period, what about the Red Scare? How does this impact them or the relationship?
the writers that I'm working on, I'm actually working on it right now, that I work on in the 30s are all communists in the U.S. Some of them anarcho-communists. There's lots of infighting among the members of the left, and they managed to publish for a period of time, certainly up till the end of World War II, and then of course they're all blacklisted. So yeah.
Are they novels or tracts? Are these
Novels. Yeah. So. It seems to, once you move out of the canon, you discover that the other things you want to read are out of print or hard to get. It's the power of the canon. So, unfortunately, Alb has never been translated into English. The Anand work is just about to come back into print. The Indian women writers, I had to get Xeroxes from the one copy, getting interlibrary loan, and a lot of the lefty work that I'm working on in the 30s is also out of print. Some of it isn't, but yeah.
What's the name of your novel?
Sorry, my book? My book is From Ought to Is, Modernism, Ethics, Politics, at least that, until Columbia tells me it can't be that title, which they will, probably. Yeah.
Do the theories of Freud or Einstein's relativity inform the political dimension of the modernist experimentation?
That's a very good question. It's, you know, it's sort of a complicated pathway, but yes, I would say. I mean, once you are thinking about a divided consciousness, for example, in terms of Freud, I mean, I always, my students get very sick of my saying, you know, 1900 was the interpretation of dreams. You know, once you are no longer self-aware and able to know everything that's going on in your head, you can't say I in quite the same way. And you need to think about your subjective experience and your relationship to yourself in a very different way. And that complicates activism. So all of the problems that they are dealing with, how to be active, how to be political, how to engage in the modern world, have some connection to that problem. The problem of Einstein's relativity is also one that you see played out in terms of how does time move forward, how do we move time forward, all over the place. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
What sort of politics around these artists do you think really pushes them to, or why are they pushed into these, into exploring these new techniques and new languages?
Well, they all come at it from a slightly different perspective. For Joyce, I think it's hard to know exactly, but it is simply his sense that the old forms couldn't represent what he wanted to represent. I mean, he just found himself farther and farther, moving farther and farther from realism. For Anand, he begins his life in sort of this maelstrom of innovation. And I mean, Barcelona was an incredible scene of avant-garde artistic activity in the 20s. So he's kind of immersed in it. I couldn't imagine him writing any other way. And then he discovers the politics, so then the question is, how do you create a political writing that also brings that avant-gardism forward? For Anand, it's clear that in part this is a question of how are we going to create a new form for India if there never had been novels in English. And there were a few at the end of the 19th century. There were some novels written by British living in India, but it's the beginning. So he's thinking, well, what form will this take? And the Indian forms don't seem to fit quite what he wants to say. So he picks up from Joyce what seems to be a usable technique. Yeah.
Is all of what the modern novel is a product of this sort of stereotyped exile, expatriate with a political agenda? Are all modernist novels like
No.
that? Or is this just a subcategory of modernist novels?
Well, yeah, I guess I did pick some. I mean, exile has always been talked about as the sort of modernist sensibility, but Virginia Woolf was never an exile. Virginia Woolf was very attached to England and its history, and she wanted to change it, but she was not an exile. So, you know, Faulkner, as we just said, writes about his home place of the South. There's certainly many, many modernists who stay at home and do their innovation. Yeah.
You mentioned that with most of the Spanish modernists, that many of them, if not all, were tied to the Republican movement. Were there any that were at all tied to the nationalist?
Actually, they're not all. Yeah, you know, Sela is certainly not Republican. There are a slew of them, and they kind of divide evenly. There's somebody, I'm not remembering the title, somebody who did a study of all of the novels, and there are hundreds of novels written in Spanish on the Spanish Civil War, and they kind of divide evenly. What's interesting is that most of them are partisan in some way or another, which is why Orwell's point is well taken. But some of them pretend to objectivity, but they're not, right? They want to present this third person omniscient, you know, this is how it was, but it's seen completely from the perspective of the Republicans. You know, all the fascists are horrible torturers, or the other way around. Yeah. There isn't, that the periodization of modernism is variable around the world, that we can't really constrain it. We used to say it stops at 45. Clearly, Obe is writing this sequence. He begins it in 42 and keeps going. So what do you do there? It's very hard to set an endpoint to any sort of periodization. When we talk about modernism in South America, or we talk about modernism in Africa, often people say it doesn't even get started until especially in Africa, till 45. So, as I said, a lot of people want to read J.M. Coetzee, who recent Nobel Prize winner, South African writer. A lot of people read him as a modernist. I know someone who's working on Ishiguro, current British writer, as a modernist. So I guess the answer is no, it doesn't end.
Then my follow-up question, and changing, I guess, to totally lowbrow.
Yeah.
Hunter S. Thompson would seem to be almost along the lines of this thing. His
Yeah.
separation of himself from what he's writing. The only difference is that you might argue he's not a novelist, but then argue maybe
He's a
argue it's
gonzo
fiction.
journalist, right?
Well, but it's
Yeah.
fiction, right?
Yeah.
But it isn't. It's
Yeah.
somewhere in between.
Right, and yeah, I mean, I would say that what he's doing is borrowing the techniques of modernism that have become, by the time he's writing, sort of part of the air. Something that he could, I'm not sure he would consciously stylize himself. I mean, sometimes we want to say, well, it depends upon whether the writer was consciously picking up these techniques or saying, I'm trying to make it new.
Or if he was conscious at all.
Or if he was conscious at all, yeah.
Okay, thank you so much.